Well, welcome. This is Questioning Christianity, where we seek to connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And in this conversation series, our goal is to try and gather all the questions that you send in through our various social media channels, or where you can ask a question on our website at questioningchristianity.com. And then we pull them together and then thematically organize them so that we can bring on experts who know what they're talking about and put them in the hot seat to field many of your questions. And tonight you are in for a treat because I have on a dear friend of mine, a former colleague of mine, but someone who is way more intelligent than me to try and tackle difficult questions around neuroscience, around consciousness, around the brain. She has her PhD from Cambridge in medical imaging, spent a lot of time exploring the role of MRI and mapping the brain as the development of this technology, and has thought long and hard about the integration of Christian faith and our understanding of the science when it comes to our minds, our brains, and consciousness, and the philosophical questions that throws up. I am indeed speaking of the one and only Dr. Sharon Dirckx.
Hi, Dan. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Well, let's just give people a little bit of a window into your background, because from what I understand, you weren't exactly born into Christian faith. So can you explain a little bit how you came to believe in God and the path that led you there?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very loving home, one in which kind of religious beliefs just weren't really talked about one way or another. And I guess the other thing that kind of happened as I was growing up is that I began to realize from an early age that I love the sciences. And so I along the way kind of absorbed the view that science and God were incompatible, and that thinking people weren't religious people, and all of that. And I remember my A-level biology teacher giving me a copy of Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, which had only been out a few years at that point. This was in the 1980s. And I arrived at university with the assumption that belief in God and Christian faith and being a rigorous scientist were just no go. They were incompatible. And so, in my first week of university, I was invited to what was known as Guerrilla Christian. It was this event that was being put on in my hall of residence, and so
Sure.
along I went and sat through these whole host of questions that were asked to these four Christians. And about halfway through the evening, I put my hand up and asked my question, which was, surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. And I guess was given the answer that yes, you can. It's a bit like, asking someone to choose between God and science is a bit like asking someone to choose between Bill Gates and programming languages that undergird Microsoft Office, and you look at that for 1 second and realize you don't need to choose. These are actually two parallel but very different kinds of explanation for Microsoft Office. One describing the underlying mechanisms, the other one describing the one whose idea it was and who set it in motion. And of course, together, those two explanations give you a more complete understanding of Office. If you just try and understand it in terms of the underlying mechanisms, then you you leave with a diminished view of this thing. And so that was a game changer for me. No one had ever given any kind of reason or answer like that for me. And so I spent the next 18 months grilling a lot more Christians and asking a lot more questions.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess I got to the point where I didn't have all of my questions answered. There were still some kind of things that were kind of still unanswered. But I was also gradually realizing that there was more to life than just what I could see with my eyes. And about halfway through this biochemistry degree, I actually, yeah, became a follower of Jesus. I ended up praying, and I don't exactly remember when. It was sometime between Easter and summer. I think by summer of my second year, I was a Christian. Yeah, I don't exactly know, but I
Well,
definitely was by the end of year two. So
interesting. And you went
yeah.
on from this beginning in the sciences to do your PhD in medical imaging. I'm kind of curious along the way, what got you fascinated in the brain specifically?
Well, there was a bit of a journey there. So I first heard about MRI when I was an undergrad doing this biochemistry degree, and two friends of mine in the physics department were doing a study using this really archaic MRI machine that was pretty much held together with duct tape, I would say. Um, but I was really fascinated by this technology that allowed you to look inside a biological organism without making any cut into it. And that is why MRI is so revolutionary, and we're all benefiting from it in terms of our knee scans and brain scans and so on, whole body scans, and that it can look inside the human body without physically invading it. And so then I went on to do a year in industry in Basel, in Switzerland, actually, working in pharmaceutical industry. And there I got to do some MRI. And I then began to look for places to study for a PhD, and that sent me to Cambridge. And there was a brain
Kind
imaging.
of bottom of the table when it comes to options for doing a PhD, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a massive privilege and blessing
Yeah,
to be there. I don't take it lightly. It wasn't an easy time, actually.
sure.
The data of my PhD didn't come easily to me. It was a bit of a wrestle, and it was a bit of a trust in God. And I was still a fairly young Christian at that point. And those of you listening that wouldn't call yourselves Christians may not necessarily make sense, but it was a time at which God actually spoke quite clearly to me when I was actually thinking of actually not doing it and actually kind of stopping and giving up, that God actually said, stay. And it was a time of realizing that this bizarre paradox of God being the kind of the creator of the cosmos and everything that is, and he existed before anything material existed, and we'll get to that in a minute with the mind-brain problem, but also that cared about me as a person, typing numbers into a computer or into an Excel spreadsheet. And that was mind-blowing for me, that God would be sort of transcendent and very big and powerful, but also very immanent and present with each individual. And that was actually a really key part of what got me through actually my PhD time.
Wow. Sure, there's way more to dive into in terms of the experience at Cambridge as well, which can be
Yes.
really encouraging for some people in terms of the spiritual temperature of many of these elite universities. Other times it can be a real challenge in terms of the intellects and the objections that you find in some of those places of learning. But how about we dive into the material we want to cover tonight, which is specifically
Yeah.
focused at one of your books. You've written a couple, and in fact, you've just finished the manuscript for a third on Broken World, Broken Earth, Broken World. Broken
Planet.
Planet. There we go. I was close. One nearly there. Really exploring the theme of
Something terrible.
natural evil, natural suffering, natural disasters. Your first book, Why, kind of picks up on some of that similar material. So obviously developing this a bit further. I found that incredibly helpful because a lot of the explorations around evil and suffering kind of focus more on the moral evil problem, or why does God let bad things happen, and the reason of human agency and free will and those sorts of things normally come out. But you pick up particularly in there, and
Yeah.
particularly in your new book, more on people's experience of suffering at the hands of the natural world, natural disaster, disease, death, these sorts of things, which is just a different dimension to that question, often much more difficult to tackle. So kudos for diving in there. And we'll have to get you back when the book comes out to kind of field some of those questions. But your second book, this brilliant little volume, Am I Just My Brain, really dives more, I guess, into your research expertise and background to explore something more classically known as the mind-body problem, mind-brain problem. Would love to hear how, first, if you could parse that out for us. Probably many of our audience have never really heard what that is. But then also some of the options that you go through to be able to make sense of that in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose where I start is with, it seems like, we live in an age of neuroscience and the sciences, and they can tell us extraordinary things. And I spent over 10 years studying the human brain using functional MRI, looking inside it when, volunteers are doing all kinds of incredible things. And clearly, neuroscience can tell us extraordinary things, and the brain is a phenomenal metabolic kind of dynamo. Um, but there is also the view out there that everything that it means to be you is explained entirely in terms of this this 2 kilo thing that sits inside your skull. And is that true? We've got some very bright neuroscientists and philosophers believe this. One would be, someone like Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix with James Watson, who said, your memories, your sorrows, your joys, your ambitions, everything that it means to be you're nothing but a pack of neurons, essentially.
Wow.
And you've got other people like the late Colin Blakemore, who I heard died very recently, saying that that the brain is a machine that alone determines your memories and everything that it means to be you. And so we need to respond to this view. Is it the case that the brain essentially drives and determines the person? Well, the way that the mind-brain problem comes into this is because we don't just have a brain; we also have a mind. So you have the brain with all of its neurons and chemicals and transmitters and synapses and electrical activity. But then you've also got the mind with all of its emotions and feelings and memories and decisions. And I suppose the million-dollar question is, how do you get from one to the other? How do you get from neurons to thoughts? How do you get from chemical activity in your head to essentially what it's like to be you? And this is not a new question. Sometimes it can appear that the arrival and the rise of the sciences has suddenly thrown this question onto our laps, and we now have to kind of scramble to find answers. But this question it goes back to the ancient world. Aristotle, Plato, and so on were all discussing the body-soul problem, and there were physicalists in their day as well that they were kind of in conversation with. And so we have
And
a
when
mind.
you say physicalists, just quickly, you mean people that make sense of everything purely on physical terms, that the only things that we are atoms.
Right. So even back in the ancient world, there were what's known as atomists. People like Lucretius and
Yeah.
Epicurus would say that the soul is matter. You are everything that you think. So Plato and Aristotle were dualists, arguing for an immaterial soul, which we can come to. But they were also in debate with physicalists in their
Yeah.
day as well, who believed that it was all material. So this is not a new question. It's not a new conversation. It's been going on since the ancient world. And even with the brightest minds being thrown at this conversation, and even with the advancement in the sciences that we now have, there is still no consensus on how on earth you get from neurons to thoughts or brain activity to what it is like to be you. And one of the reasons for that is because of what some philosophers refer to as qualia. Dan, you've probably had a coffee today, at least one, maybe several. You
It's
have one.
nighttime, and this might be one right here.
Wow, I can't drink the stuff and after about 4 p.m. Otherwise, I'll be up all night. Never mind. Anyway, um, um, but imagine I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee, and if it's true that we live in a purely material universe and everything is physical, all you have to work with is physical descriptions. So, describe to me the smell of coffee in physical terms. What would you say?
I'm at a bit of a loss, other than it makes my brain do things to get excited.
Yeah, you could describe the physical impact on your brain
Yeah.
in terms of impact of caffeine in making you more alert and more perceptive and all of those things. You could describe the chemical structure of caffeine, I suppose. You could describe the physiology of it as it goes into your body. But none of those things get you any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand the smell of coffee, you need to smell it. And there is no other way to get to that point. And this is an example of a quale in its singular, or the plural qualia. And of course, the biggest qualia is the qualitative experience of what it is like to be you. There is
Yeah.
something that it is to be you, to use the phrase that Thomas Nagel used back in 1974. There's something that it is to be you. And that cannot be captured with a physical description. And this is why we have this problem. And so someone like David Chalmers of Australian National University and also New York University describes it as the hard problem of consciousness.
Mm.
How on earth do you describe what something is like using physical terms?
Well, let's dive into that, because what I found really helpful about your book is you're not just putting forward one view; you contrast a few different options. Effectively the DTR. Let's define this relationship between the mind and the brain in a few different ways. And could you spell out those few different options as they kind of come to us today?
Yes, absolutely. So the first one is to highlight the position that we've just been talking about, which is essentially saying that the mind is the brain. If you're saying that all that exists are chemicals and transmitters, then the view that everything is physical is essentially saying there isn't a mind, there's only a brain. And so it's kind of saying that there isn't really anything that it is like to be you. There's just brain activity. But of course, this view is absurd because first of all, it undermines itself. The person expressing this view is essentially saying, well, my first person perspective on the world is that there is no first person perspective on the world. There is chemical activity. And so it's self-defeating, actually, at a level, a logical level. And
Is
the
this like
second thing,
basically saying that you're like in the passenger seat, effectively, you're only ever experiencing what comes, but the brain itself is actively driving you? Would that be a fair way
yes,
of putting it?
I think that's
So
right.
your
It's
your
not,
perception of agency is not real. It's like, if I gave my child a little steering wheel up in the seat next to me, they have the sense that they're driving the car. But that's not real. I'm driving the car. They're just
right.
mistaken in their perception.
Exactly. And there are one of the massive implications is in the area of free will. That actually it's not you that's making decisions about your life; it's actually your brain. You're being driven by forces beyond your control. So we
I want
begin
to
to
ask about that a little bit later, but yep.
yeah.
Okay, so
So anyway,
that's a problem with that one.
that's a problem with that one. There are all kinds of problems with that one. There are problems for the scientific view as well. If we are wanting to study the natural world, but you're saying that our very minds or brains with which we do that study is of the same substance of the world that we study, then how on earth do we transcend it to draw conclusions about the world of study? So it undermines
Yeah.
the whole of the sciences as well. So that's that view. And so but the important thing to say is that not every agnostic or even atheist would hold this view. I would say a small number of very vocal atheists might hold this view, but there are alternative views that many thinkers subscribe to. So one of those is that the brain generates the mind, or that the mind it emerges from the physical properties
Yeah.
of the brain. And this might be referred to as emergentism, or some might say non-reductive physicalism as well. And so this view says that when a number of component parts come together, something new comes into being that is greater than the sum of its parts. A bit like a film has a number of building blocks. It has a script, it has a cast, it has a soundtrack, it has a director, it has all kinds of component, the camera crew, and so on. And you need all of those building blocks. But when you bring them all together, something new comes into being. A film comes into being that you watch and that you experience. And this view is essentially saying when a number of different building blocks of the brain come together and grow and increase in complexity, something new, the mind actually emerges from that. And this is a view that a number of atheists and theists hold to. But the problem with this view is still that we still come up against the hard problem of consciousness. How exactly does a physical system create or cause a mind to emerge from it? You still have the problem of does the mind emerge from a physical system? But of course, and if that system is only material, the hard problem remains as hard as ever. And that's possibly why some physicalists resort to reductive physicalist approaches, because they're easier to defend. Because how on earth you explain emergence in a materialistic universe is near on impossible. But if the system isn't closed, if God exists, then you have additional information that can help you bridge this chasm from physical neurons and brain cells to thoughts and consciousness. And that is the reason why there are Christian theists that would hold to an emergentist position, because they believe the system isn't closed. There's
Would this
more
be
information.
sort of the rise of or becoming more popular of the group known as Christian physicalists? So people that believe that humans just are material creatures, but this would be the theory that they would adopt in view of that, that there is still a mind which has real agency, but it emerges simply as a production of the various components of the brain itself.
I would think so. I mean, with every view, you've got different expressions and different ways of defining it. But I think that in principle that's right. And of course, the value of this view is we want to be responsive to the very obvious fact that the mind and the brain are clearly connected, and no one is disputing that. If we know that. The brain grows in development in the unborn, and the level of consciousness grows in the unborn as the brain develops. Changes in the brain impact changes in consciousness. If you put a healthy human being in an MRI scanner and give them a task to do that uses their mind, you see their networks in the brain light up in response to the use of their mind. And of course, we see in degenerative diseases that as someone's brain degenerates, something happens to their mind as well. There's a question about personhood that we can come to later, but clearly mental state and brain state are connected very, very closely. And of course, those that are wanting to, people that perhaps hold the emergentist view are wanting to honor that and
Yeah.
try and explain it, really.
And you'd see that too within the animal kingdom, where creatures of various different brain development sizes are able to have various degrees of seeming consciousness or interaction with the world, or more complex emotions, or communication with their own groups. And so
Right.
there's maybe trying to honor that diversity that's seen as well.
And it's proportional to the extent to which they have a neocortex. And I guess the biggest difference, which is the kind of the bit that sits around all of the kind of fundamental mid-brain structures that are needed just to be alive.
Yeah.
You've got the cortex that sort of sits around that, and then the most recent part is the frontal cortex, which is the one that Homo sapiens has to the greatest degree that other creatures don't have. And so clearly the brain is relevant. It's not irrelevant to this conversation, and is clearly connected. But just because these two things are connected does not mean necessarily that they are synonymous. It could be that the brain mediates consciousness,
Yeah.
and it's a God-given kind of faculty to mediate it. But as we kind of
This would be maybe a third option then. So if you've got the purely material perspective, the reductive view, and then this one, the non-reductive physicalism or the emergent property, this view that the brain mediates kind of consciousness, is that a sort of third perspective in
well, it
more of a
could be.
dualistic vision, or?
It could be. It's not the way I phrase it in my book. It's actually the
Okay.
way that Ian McGilchrist phrased it. I was in a dialogue with him recently. I don't know if you're familiar with
I did see that. That was fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. So he uses that phrasing, and he parcels things up a little differently. But the way that I describe the third position is that the mind is beyond the brain,
Okay.
in a sense, and that would be describing substance dualism, which is essentially saying that the brain is a physical substance and the mind is a non-physical substance, and these two again are connected, but they can also exist independently of one another, because they are substances in their own right. And again, this is a view that Plato and Aristotle defended various different versions of substance dualism. You have René Descartes in the Enlightenment, who kind of really brought this conversation alive again as well. And And there are obviously many actually very bright people, many of whom are in Oxford, people like Professor Richard Swinburne, Keith Ward, and then in Notre Dame in the US, you've got Alvin Plantinga, people that actually defend notions of free will and individual agency and personhood precisely on the basis of a substance dualist view of the human being, which is to say that you're not simply driven internally by the chemical forces and structures in your brain, but you have agency that comes from that's independent of that, that can influence the body and brain as well.
Which would probably be more the classic view that many people would have in their mind of something material and something immaterial. And there's some kind of curious link, but we are these two different
Yeah,
things kind of brought together, some kind of psychosomatic whole.
right.
So
Yeah.
the mind
Well,
is the
there's
brain, the mind emerges from the brain, and the mind is
yeah,
beyond the brain are kind of the
yeah.
three broad options.
Well, yes, there's a fourth one if you'd like to talk
I would
about
love
that as well.
to, because I have an inkling, but I was going to ask you. So I'd love to hear the fourth option.
Yeah, and then there's actually what we think the Bible might say, which is another conversation. But the fourth one is actually a view that is increasingly on the rise, which is panpsychism, which comes from the Greek meaning pan, all, and psyche meaning soul, and it essentially says, look, let's solve the hard problem not by starting with physical building blocks, but by starting with human consciousness as fundamental. Let's make that primary and try and build a bridge back to the brain. And so this view says, look, everything is conscious. Every living thing is actually everything is conscious, even down to the atomic scale. There are, as Philip Goff of Durham University put it, there are unimaginably small levels of consciousness, even in quarks and electrons and so on. And you work your way up the complexity tree and you end up with kind of conscious human beings. And this is a really interesting view that actually, I think, opens up the conversation because it acknowledges that just trying to do it all from a material base doesn't get you very far. And it puts consciousness back on the table as something that we need to discuss. But it does have some questions around it. First of all, if there are, conscious elements in every living thing, then that means our human bodies are made up of trillions of conscious kind of elements. But we only have one. The thing about consciousness is you only have one conscious experience. It's all integrated. And so how do you explain the integrated nature of consciousness? The fact that it's a unity, you have one
Yeah.
integrated experience. And the second thing is, it doesn't help us explain why there does seem to be a very different level of consciousness in Homo sapiens compared to other members of the animal kingdom. So it's a very interesting view, and I've had some interesting conversations around it. But there are also
I've
some questions in my mind.
I've definitely seen that on the rise, particularly in the philosophy of religion sort of conversations online. And some of this I recognize may be pitched a little bit higher than a lot of the audience may be used to, or it might be a first introduction to them to these sorts of themes. So kudos to everyone for being able to stick with us thus far. But what you've shared so far, Sharon, just opens up a ton of different options for us to track down. And out of those four views that you've just put out there, I'm curious as to which one right now you find most persuasive, and whether that's driven by your philosophical understanding of things, or how your Christian faith and maybe the concept of the Bible's use of language of soul or spirit or spiritual kind of feeds into this conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to be slightly awkward, I would actually say that, in a sense, apart from the first one, that the mind is the brain, there are elements of all of those views that are helpful as we kind of piece together what a biblical picture of human beings is. Firstly, we could take from panpsychism that, yes, consciousness is primary, and actually that's how we can make the case that we can make better sense of why we are conscious if God exists than if he doesn't, because we find ourselves to be conscious beings. But if we are in a non-conscious universe, how on earth did conscious beings come to arise from
Yeah.
within a universe of time plus matter plus chance? what is the best explanation for that? Is it that we are just here purely by accident and consciousness is an accidental, incidental kind of thing that happened? Or is it the case that we have been in a conscious universe right from the beginning? And that, before anything material existed, God existed, and God is a conscious being, existing in a conscious community of Father and Son and Holy Spirit, and which kind of means it's possible to be conscious without a body, which is probably a controversial thing to say, but that would be the case for God. But then, of course, we see with humans, he creates matter and then breathes into it. And if you read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, you would see that God seems to create substance and breathe life into it. So panpsychism is helpful in the primacy of consciousness. And then, but of course, substance dualism is helpful in helping us recognize that there's more to us than simply the material. There is an immaterial dimension to life. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And then emergentism helps us to realize that these two things are very integrated and work very closely together. The biblical view, as I see it, seems to be that it seems to be one of holism, HOLISM, that we are integrated beings. And so that's why I don't want to jump immediately. People might be thinking, I'm going to immediately jump to a dualistic view. But there are some problems with the way that substance dualism is portrayed, as somehow we have this physical part to us, and then we have this immaterial part that is kind of floating and not necessarily integrated, and how do those two things interact? But the view that we see in the Bible is that we are integrated physical and spiritual beings, and we are to live integrated lives. But there is a dualism in the sense that we will survive the death of our bodies. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Now, he didn't just kind of float off to heaven, and he actually responded to people that thought he was a ghost, which would be like a Platonic view of resurrection, that, you're sort of ghostly, floaty, slightly immaterial being. But what we see is that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, and so we see holism, integrated physical and spiritual beings. So I haven't given you a clean answer, and I think that's really
sometimes that's helpful though, in the sense that for many people watching, there is a temptation to want clean answers to difficult questions. And so often we get leanings, and there's enough to guide away from unhelpful answers, but it does still leave various options open, each with various strengths and other weaknesses. And we have to do the best that we can to try and faithfully represent what we think is true. And sometimes we're less certain of that, or we're trying to draw and come up with the best conclusion from various parts. I do appreciate that kind of a response. What would you say to someone like a Daniel Dennett figure? So there might be people more on the skeptical end of the spectrum watching this, who he's a big name. He works in this field. He's convinced that our consciousness and agency is merely an illusion. At least the way that we tend to think about it is illusory. What would be your response to anyone who comes from that kind of an ilk of thinking?
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole view of Daniel Dennett's is very curious, because if consciousness is illusory, it actually becomes, if that is true, it becomes impossible to say anything of meaning, because how do we not know that even Dennett, in expressing that view, is kind of succumbing to the illusion of consciousness and the view that he is expressing, and that if consciousness, as he puts it, is somehow a trick of the brain, then how do we know that those same forces are not at work in providing Dennett with his own argumentation? And so the view
It kind of
itself
undermines rationality in that way, doesn't it? Any
really
argument that
does.
you make could purely be foisted upon you by all of the
Right.
forces that conspire to create that
Exactly.
determined moment. Yeah.
And the notion of illusion, if you think about yourself in a magic show and you're watching something and you're being, in a sense, tricked, or your perception about reality is not correct, but you are still experiencing the magic show, you are still consciously experiencing it. And so even illusion is undergirded by consciousness. Do you see? Even it presupposes consciousness, even the notion of illusion, and so you
That's
can't get
interesting.
away from this thing of there is something that it is to be you, and that the idea that we're trying to say no, there isn't, is crazy. It's
Yeah.
really, and of course, a great number of philosophers agree with this and say, look, we do not and we cannot live without presupposing that there is something that it is to be us.
And the kind
Um,
of knock-on effect when it comes to free will, that sort of agency as well. This is a big one. I remember speaking with a young guy a few years ago who had grown up within a Christian family, but himself had kind of wandered away from belief in God and rather armed himself with some skeptical arguments, and wanted to have a bit of a sparring match. So I got in touch. He's like, I want to try this stuff out on you, and he was convinced that free will had been entirely done away with through scientific exploration. There was a particular series of experiments done back in the 1980s. What was the guy's name? Libet, was it? The
yeah,
Yeah, but exploring by doing EEG, hooking up, seeing what parts of the brain, when they become active in terms of the decision-making process, and when people became
yeah,
conscious of them making a decision, that's
yeah,
when they tap a little button and lets it know. But he was identifying actually the brain states that were causing this effect were being lit up sometimes seconds in advance of them actually making that decision or becoming
yeah.
consciously aware. So, it does away with consciousness, does away with free will. There's no such thing. What's the best response that you have? Why do you
Yeah,
believe in free will? What's the best argument for free will? How do you
yeah,
respond to those experiments?
yeah. Thank you. Well, let me start with the experiments first. First thing to say that even though Benjamin Libet actually does believe in free will, and about 10 years after those studies, he wrote to say that why he does. I'll come to that in a minute. But um, yeah, the studies that he conducted, there have been all kinds of interpretations and repeats of the studies to try and see what happened. And there seemed to have been something about the way they modeled the data. And the data that they published was averaged over a number of subjects, but when they broke it down and looked at each individual subject, they didn't see the same signal arising before they were consciously aware of their decision to press the button. They saw it happen in parallel with their conscious decision. So there's something about the analysis that might have been a little bit kind of biasing the results slightly. There's also something about they had to watch a clock and watch this kind of dot circling, and that was influencing when they pressed. And some people think that just the mere fact of watching this dot go around in circles is generating something which could explain that early activity as well. And then there's also the interpretation, look, your brain does get ready when it's about to make a decision, and so this could be your brain just getting decision ready. That doesn't mean that that was the decision that your brain is making it for you. It's just that your brain is preparing to make a decision. And so essentially we don't need to be threatened or worried by these results. Libet wrote himself several years later to say he does believe in free will, because even if there are even if there are kind of forces that arise in our brain without our conscious awareness, we have the ability to veto them. And that is from within our consciousness, our conscious awareness. It's what we call self control or resisting temptation. It's the basis of the Ten Commandments. And even neuroscientists have a term for it called inhibitory control. It's something that is kind of lacking or diminished in those with addictions and things like that. And so even if these impulses arise without our conscious awareness, we have the ability to veto them, to say yes or no to something that comes to our conscious awareness. So Libet has not written off free will, and he himself admits that. And of course, philosophically, we run into all kinds of problems. If we're saying that everything about us is driven by forces beyond our control, then the very view that you are expressing is meaningless. because it is itself driven by forces beyond your control, and it's not you expressing it. It's determined by forces beyond your control.
And it
And
becomes
of
almost
course,
like a form of brainwashing then, because anything that we do come up with isn't necessarily the end result of a rational process where you're spelling out premises that lead to warranted conclusions, but effectively you're just spouting out content that you hope will become a
yeah,
virus in someone else's brain that they come to the same conclusion.
yeah,
So it does seem to
exactly.
have a problematic element to it.
It does, and it prompts very mildly put, yes. And that it also doesn't explain the human passion and desire that we see throughout history in every age for human rights and for our rights and for our care for individuals. Why would you even bother fighting for your rights if there is no really any such thing as free will?
Mm.
We want to be in control. We want to have autonomy, good and bad. Where does that come from if there is no such thing as free will? And of course, we reward good behavior, we punish bad precisely on the basis that people have been responsible for the actions that they have taken. And of course, the other big area and implication, if there is no free will, is what do you do with moral responsibility? It's
Yeah.
completely undermined, and you can bring no justice in the courts. You can bring no rewards to those who've been incredibly brave in war and all sorts of things. And so we really need to think very carefully about what we mean when we start saying free will doesn't exist. And we need to think it through to its logical conclusion and say, actually, do I agree with where that lands? And if I don't, then we need to think about maybe we got starting premises wrong in the first place.
Yeah, there's so much at stake in this conversation when you think about it. As
Yeah,
abstract as it can sound from the outset, when you start to dig
yeah,
into the various pieces, you're like, wow, this actually affects everything that I do, everything that I understand about who I am.
yeah.
Super helpful. Hey, the place where this comes really real for me personally. I'm not sure if I've shared part of this story with you before, Sharon, and I know you've got your own family experience that drives some of your exploration around the natural suffering sort of questions. But when I was young, we had a car accident. My mum had a really significant head trauma, where she would describe in the aftermath, and certainly family members look back, and there's a different person emerges out the other side. So serious head injury, brain damage to various parts of her brain, ongoing loss of memory, physical impacts as a result of that. But just the part of her brain that controls chemical release, hormone management, all of that was just shot. And so having to figure out chemical cocktails and psychiatry and all of this to try and normalize her brain function. And so these are not abstract questions, who is she? How does consciousness change through these moments of trauma? I know you've spent a fair bit of time thinking and writing about these questions as they relate particularly to the people who have all kinds of mental or cognitive disabilities and traumas like this. So what do you think the Christian story in particular offers as a point of hope to
Yeah,
this experience that I've just described for my family?
yeah. Thanks, Dan, for sharing that. I didn't know that about your story, and I'm really sorry to hear that. And this is why the answer that you give to the question, "Am I just my brain?" is so important. Because if we are just our brains, then as our brain changes, be that dramatically and overnight or gradually over a lifetime, then we change. And if we are in a state of degeneration, then we are gradually fading away as our brain degenerates. But if there is more to us than just our brains, then even if there are dramatic changes to our brain, there is still a you that remains. In fact, the Bible says the opposite happens. It says, even though outwardly we are wasting away, inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Now, there's the dualism, if you want to see it in there, that outwardly we are wasting away, and we're all in decline at beyond the age of 18, let's face it. Some of
Certainly
us
feels
are
that
more
way.
um, but that actually in relationship with God, there's something that's growing internally, even alongside that external decline, and that growth is in fellowship, in friendship with God through the Holy Spirit, and that is what is available to anyone and everyone who will accept it, that actually if Jesus is risen from the dead and is alive in the world today and wants to be at work in the lives of anyone that will have him, he breathes life and light and gives strength you never knew you had. And especially coping with a trauma such as the one you've described, that actually going through that with God is surely more bearable than
Yeah.
without him.
Yeah.
um, and so that is the Christian story, and that actually that this life isn't all that there is, that we will, just as Jesus bodily rose from the dead, he is the forerunner of all that follow him, and that one day we will be risen from the dead as
Yeah.
well, and all of the kind of pains and troubles and struggles physically with mental health or trauma that we carry in our bodies right now, these will be made new, and we will be resurrected and made whole and made new. And it will still be us. There is no diminishing of the individual person. That is upheld and maintained through death and out the other side and into the new heaven and new earth, which again is embodied, it is whole, it is physical and spiritual, and it
Yeah.
is every bit as real as this life that we see, that seems so real that it could, how could there possibly be another reality that's bigger and better than this one? I can't get my head around it, but I know that it is true because I see glimpses of it every once in a while when God breaks in and does something extraordinary. And actually, that is what will be reality in the new heaven and the new earth.
That's genuinely beautiful. And I appreciate that so much, just sort of speaking to the story that I shared for our family. When you say you can't get your head around it, though, do you mean you can't get your mind around it or you can't get your brain around it? Just sort of
Sorry, yeah.
push back on that
I'll
one. But
probably
but
go with those things because they're integrated.
I've so appreciated what you've had to share, Sharon, because in the way that you bring these things to light, not only does the Christian story, as I've understood in this area, actually open up options, right? There is no definitive Christian answer. But if you bring God into the picture and mind before matter, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, and then brought all things into being. It just means you have options to make sense of the philosophical questions and the scientific data. It opens up inquiry and invites us in. It provides a grounds for rationality and meaning, as well as this profound sense of hope. That the thing that drives us to study, and for many of us, the kind of traumas or sadness of seeing ones that we love waste away or disappear off the scene, that they're not gone, and that death is not the dead end. The Christian story offers explanation and hope, and I so appreciate the way you've brought that to light. If anyone is watching this and is still sort of teetering on the edge of where you were as you were entering into your undergraduate studies, and just with questions trying to figure out, is Jesus really worth believing in? Is the Christian stories good news and true news for me? What might you say to them as sort of a parting message?
Oh, I would say that if something is true, then it will be something that can satisfy intellectually and emotionally, and that was absolutely my experience. And so I would want to say, ask your questions, and if something is true, it can hold the weight of the difficult question that you ask. And so ask them and find people that you can ask your questions to. My experience is that I came to not just have my questions answered, but I came to meet a person who was real and alive, and powerful in the world, but also cares for me as a person and offered me a clean start, a new slate. This is available to anyone and everyone.
I so appreciate that. That's been so helpful and fun as a conversation, just getting to chat on a bunch of these different topics. And I know we're just skirting the surface and people can go deeper. Certainly your conversation with Ian McGilchrist for the big conversation for the Premier Christian Radio stuff with Justin Briley was great. And if people want to track that down online, they can find it on YouTube. And your books, as I shared before, the one we've been looking at particularly tonight, Am I Just My Brain? It's a really worthy volume. Why? But Broken Planet, coming to an Amazon or bookstore near you in the future. If anyone listening to this wants to follow you or get behind what you're doing and your speaking and your writing, where can they go to connect?
Yeah, so you could follow me on social media. I'm at Sharon Dirckx, SharonDirckx. That is a C, a K, and an X at the end there. And I'm also an adjunct lecturer with OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. So you can find some of my material on their website as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight, Sharon. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much, Dan.
No worries. Well, we'll make sure to have Sharon Dirckx back on the channel at some point in the future when her new book comes out to really tackle many of those questions that you send in around natural suffering and the problem of evil. I'm sure that's going to make a phenomenal episode. We've got a ton more great interviews coming up as part of our conversation series, as well as our regular shorts that we release over the YouTube channel, where we're trying to tackle these big questions in 5 to 10 minutes. So if you're not subscribed yet, please do subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, and jump over to our other social media channels at QC Socials on all of the platforms to be able to find a ton of other helpful content. Our heartbeat here is to connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And certainly, like Sharon expressed, we are convinced that truth invites questioning. So if you've still got questions, if you're struggling with doubts, dig into them, keep asking. God is not afraid of our questions, and we'd love to help you on that journey. So get in contact. Love to hear from you. Thanks so much, and see you next time.